The laughter began with the first delivery of industrial-grade clear tarps. It was a bright, crisp October morning in the village of Silver Hollow, a place where traditions were as deeply rooted as the ancient pines on the ridge. Arvid Bjornsson, a man with the quiet intensity of a scholar and the calloused hands of a craftsman, unrolled the plastic sheets across his front lawn like he was laying out some strange, modern crop. Old man Henderson, tending his prize-winning roses next door, leaned on his fence, a slow grin spreading across his face. Planning a swimming pool, Arvid? Bit late in the season, isn't it? He called, his voice carrying on the still air. Arvid just smiled. A small, private thing. Something like that, Lars. The real spectacle started the next week. Arvid erected a complex latticework of wooden frames to feed out from his entire house, a modest, sturdy cabin built by his grandfather. Then, with a jury-rigged system of hoses and sprayers connected to his well, he began. Night after night, under the glow of portable work lights that turned his yard into a spectral stage, he sprayed. A fine mist of water settled on the frames, freezing layer upon gossamer layer. The villagers would walk their dogs past his property just to watch. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the growing, translucent shell. The consensus was unanimous. Arvid had finally cracked. His wife, Elara, had passed 2 winters ago, and the loneliness, they whispered, had frozen his good sense. An ice fortress, chuckled Marta from the general store, ringing up Arvid's order of another 5 gallons of distilled water. Honey, snow insulates a bit, sure, but a wall of it, right against your house, it'll melt and flood your foundation come first thaw. You'll have a mold farm by Easter. Arvid paid in cash, his expression unreadable. It's not just snow, Marta, and it won't be right against the house. There's a method. The method was obsession, born of grief and a scientist's heart. Elara had hated the winter. She'd shiver by the fire, wrapped in blankets, lamenting the draft that seeped through the old logs no matter how well he chinked them. After she was gone, the cold didn't just bite at Arvid's skin. It gnawed at his memories. He couldn't fight death, but he could fight the cold. He'd stumbled upon ancient Inuit principles of igloos and ice block windbreaks, and then fused them with his own life's work, material science. For decades, he'd worked in anonymity, testing natural sealants against modern polymers. His shed wasn't filled with firewood. It was a laboratory containing rows of sample blocks, some treated with petrochemical sealers, others with his own meticulous blends of beeswax, pine resin, and plant oils. His experiment wasn't just the ice wall, it was the sealant he planned to use on it. One evening, his only ally, young Liam from down the road, who was fascinated by anything unconventional, helped him mix a huge, double-boiler vat of a honey-thick, amber substance. The air filled with the warm, sweet scent of honeycomb and the sharp, clean tang of crushed pine needles. "What is this, Mr. Bjornsson?" Liam asked, stirring carefully. "The forgotten wisdom of trees and bees, Liam," Arvid said, watching. "The mixture meld. Beeswax is hygroscopic. It resists water but breathes. It doesn't create a brittle, suffocating shell like those chemical sealers. It flexes, it lifts, and layered between ice. It should create a perfect, breathable barrier, an insulator that actually gains strength as it gets colder." He showed Liam his graveyard, a corner of his back property where, 18 months prior, he had buried dozens of treated wood samples. They were just now being excavated for final analysis. He pulled up a block treated with a top-brand acrylic sealer. It looked pristine at first glance, but a slight twist of Arvid's hands made it squeak and powder at the seams, brittle. Failed. The soil's moisture and microbial environment have broken its spirit. Then he lifted one treated with his beeswax spine blend. It was darker, patinated, but solid as stone. He could barely make a nail scratch on it. This adapted. It became part of the environment, not a prisoner to it. Liam's eyes were wide. "So the ice wall is the test," Arvid finished, his gaze drifting to the mocking, twinkling lights of the village below. "A massive, real-world test. They think I'm building a monument to madness. I'm building a battery, a cold battery. And when the true deep freeze comes, we'll see who's laughing. By late November, Arvid's ice fortress was complete. It stood 3 feet thick, a continuous, milky blue crystalline rampart encircling his home, separated from the actual log walls by the crucial 2-foot air gap, his thermal buffer zone. The final step had been the most bizarre to onlookers. With a large, soft brush, Arvid had painstakingly painted the entire interior surface of the ice, the side facing the air gap, with his warmed, liquid beeswax blend. It dried to a faint, golden sheen, like the inside of a candle holder. The village's mockery had softened from derisive laughter to a kind of pitying head shaking. They'd bring him casseroles, not out of neighborly love for the experiment, but out of concern for the experimenter. The first major snowstorm arrived just after Thanksgiving, dumping 2 feet of dry, powdery snow. It clung to the angular contours of Arvid's ice wall, adding another layer of natural insulation. From the outside, his house looked like a bizarre, sunken sculpture, a crystalline bunker inside. Arvid was already noticing a difference. The usual, persistent draft that snuck under the door and through the old chinking was gone. The silence was profound. The howling wind was muted to a distant whisper by the massive ice barrier. His wood stove, which normally had to be stoked relentlessly to maintain a comfortable temperature, seemed to be overachieving. For the first time in years, he sat in his living room in a light sweater, not a heavy parka. Meanwhile, the rest of Silver Hollow hunkered down. Furnaces whirred, chimneys belched smoke, and the constant thrum of generators was the village's winter heartbeat. Old man Henderson's heating oil bill, he complained loudly at the post office, was already looking like a telephone number from a foreign country. The real test began in mid-December, when the polar vortex descended. Temperatures plummeted to -30°F, not accounting for the bone-sawing wind chill. The world became a study in shades of blue and white, and the very air crackled with lethal cold. In the village, the strain was immediate. Pipes froze despite heat tape. Cars refused to start. The community center opened as an emergency shelter. When the Johnson family's furnace gave a final smoky gasp and died, through it all, a strange report began to circulate. Young Liam, who delivered groceries to Arvid twice a week, started telling tales in the school cafeteria. "It's warm in there," he insisted, his breath making little clouds in the frigid air of the bus stop. Like, take your coat off. Warm, and he's only using, like, 2 logs a day, the inside of the ice wall. It's not even melting. It's got this weird, shiny skin on it. He was met with scoffing. "Liam's gone loopy too," the others said, probably just trying to stay on the crazy old man's good side for Christmas tips. But curiosity, like the cold, has a way of seeping in. One evening, during the worst of the freeze, Old Man Henderson found himself shoveling his driveway. For the 3rd time that day, his bones aching with a deep, percussive chill, he looked over at Arvid's property. No smoke rose from the chimney. The usual plume of heat from the side vent of his furnace was absent. The house was a silent, snowy mound. A flicker of genuine concern, cutting through years of mild rivalry, sparked in him. Had the old fool finally frozen to death in his own absurd experiment? Grumbling, Henderson trudged through the deep snow between their properties, climbed over the low berm of plowed snow that bordered Arvid's yard, and approached the ice wall. He found the entrance a clever, tunnel-like passage Arvid had maintained. Through the ice, lined with a heavy curtain, pushing it aside, he stepped into the 2-foot gap between ice and house. The effect was immediate and disorienting. The screaming wind vanished. The brutal, dry cold was replaced by a still, cool air, perhaps for F. It was refrigerated, but it wasn't painful. He could feel the immense, radiant cold of the ice wall to his left. But to his right, the log walls of the house felt neutral. No, more than neutral. He placed a bare hand on a log. It felt like wood on a cool autumn day, not the frozen, sap-cracked surface he'd expected. His heart hammered with something that wasn't exertion. He knocked on Arvid's back door. Arvid opened it, and a wave of palpable, dry heat washed over Henderson. The scent of baking bread and pine resin followed. Arvid stood in socks, A flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "Lars," Arvid said, his voice calm. "Come in. You look like you've seen a ghost." Henderson stepped over the threshold into what felt like a different continent. The air was a perfect, comfortable 72F. A small fire crackled cheerfully in the wood stove, more for light and cheer than necessity. Houseplants thrived on the windowsills. Arvid's cat was sprawled in a patch of sunlight on the rug, utterly relaxed. Henderson couldn't speak. He just stood there, his frost-dipped cheeks beginning to tingle and burn in the warmth, his eyes taking in the impossible coziness. The evidence of his own shivering body and the paradise around him was irrefutable. The mockery, the certainty, the entire village's understanding of winter. It all shattered in that moment, melting away faster than ice in this impossible, warm room. The thaw in old man Henderson's attitude was almost as dramatic as the one he was physically experiencing. He sat at Arvid's kitchen table, cradling a mug of strong, sweet tea, his grizzled face a canvas of stunned confusion. "How?" was all he could manage, the word steaming into the comfortable air. Arvid, sensing a genuine question instead of a prelude to ridicule, became animated. He led Henderson not to the living room, but to his shed laboratory. He showed him the burial test samples, the meticulous journals with graphs of thermal retention, the failed, brittle chemical sealers next to the resilient, amber-hued beeswax-treated blocks. He explained, in terms a gardener could understand, the principle of the phase change barrier. "The ice wall isn't a static thing, Lars," Arvid said, his eyes alight. "It's a dynamic boundary. The beeswax sealer on the inside does too. Things first, it dramatically slows the sublimation of the ice, turning directly to water vapor. It locks the cold in. Second, and most importantly, it turns the entire mass into a thermal buffer. It absorbs the brutal outside cold, storing it, while resisting the transfer of that cold to the house. The air gap is the critical mediator. The house's own modest heat, which would normally be stolen instantly by the wind, gently warms that gap, creating a microclimate. The ice wall, it processes the cold. It manages it." Henderson ran a calloused finger over the 18-month-old beeswax-treated wood. It felt dense, waxy, alive. He looked at the acrylic-treated sample that had turned to a crumbly mockery of itself. The metaphor was not lost on him. One worked with nature, the other fought it. And nature always won in the end. So all this time, you weren't just grieving, you were engineering, Henderson murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "I was learning," Arvid corrected softly, "from Alara, from the bees, from the trees. They know how to live with the cold, not just fight it." Word, of course, could not be contained. Henderson, a pillar of the village's pragmatic skepticism, became an unlikely and fervent apostle. He didn't just say it was warm, he described the feeling, the silence, the shocking lack of fuel consumption. Liam's youthful testimonials were now backed by the weathered credibility of the town's most stubborn rose grower. A slow pilgrimage began. First came Marta from the general store, under the guise of checking if Arvid needed more supplies. She emerged 20 minutes later, her glasses fogged, clutching a jar of Arvid's beeswax polish for my old oak table. She said quickly, but her eyes were wide with revelation. Then came the Johnson family, fresh from the shelter, there, pride swallowed by desperation and cold. Arvid welcomed them all, demonstrating not with complex jargon, but with simple touch. "Feel the log wall, feel the ice wall, feel the air in the gap." The mockery didn't just stop, it inverted the new. Hushed buzz filled the post office and the diner. Conversations shifted from the price of heating oil to questions about our values, thermal mass, and where to get bulk beeswax. The village council, facing a budget crisis from snow removal and emergency heating assistance, asked for a formal presentation. Arvid gave it in the town hall, using his samples and simple diagrams. He talked about sustainability, not as a buzzword, but as survival. He spoke of durability, of materials that endure by adapting. He explained moisture resistance not as an impermeable barrier, but as intelligent management. "The chemical sealers fail because they try to be a wall," he said, holding up the powdery acrylic block. My blend succeeds because it acts. As a skin, it breathes, it flexes with the freeze-thaw cycle. It's part of the system. He saved his masterstroke for last. On a table, he had two large blocks of ice. One was untreated. The other was coated on one side with his beeswax blend. Under identical heat lamps, the untreated ice block wept immediately. A growing puddle at its base, the treated block, however, showed only a slight, beaded condensation on its sealed surface. The water it shed was minimal, controlled. The visual was undeniable. One was succumbing to the attack. The other was regulating its response. The question from the mayor was inevitable, tinged with hope and municipal anxiety. Arvid, could this work for others? Not just a log cabin, but a regular house. Arvid smiled for the first time the public had seen in years. It was a smile of quiet vindication, not of triumph over his neighbors, but a validation for a beloved idea. The principle is universal, he said. The ice is just the most visible medium. The secret isn't in the ice. It's in the boundary. It's in working with the physics, not against them. We can't all build ice walls, but we can all think about what separates our warmth from the cold and make that separator smarter, more natural. That night, as another bitter wind scoured Silver Hollow, the plume of smoke from Arvid's chimney was still absent. But now, instead of a subject of derision, his dark, silent, warm house stood as a beacon, a quiet, crystalline proof that sometimes the wisdom that looks like madness is just waiting for the right deep freeze to reveal itself as genius. Winter, in its final, grinding weeks, became a period of profound transformation for Silver Hollow. The intense curiosity about Arvid's ice fortress evolved into a deeper, more practical community effort. It was no longer a spectacle to gawk at, but a prototype to understand. Arvid, from being the village eccentric, found himself in the unlikely role of elder-teacher. His yard, once a stage for solitary, nocturnal spraying, became a daytime workshop. He showed clusters of neighbors how to construct smaller-scale ice batteries for their root cellars and exterior basement walls. The priority wasn't artistry, but physics, creating an air gap and using available materials to create a sealed thermal mass. For those without the means for a full ice wall, he demonstrated how his beeswax fine resin blend could be thinned and applied to the interior of north-facing walls, or used to treat drafty window frames. It's not magic, he'd say patiently as people dipped brushes into the warm, fragrant mixture. It's just giving your house a better coat, one that breathes. The local hardware store, initially skeptical, saw a run on spray insulation and weather stripping, but the real shift was in the questions customers asked. They weren't just looking for the strongest seal. They asked about flexibility, about vapor permeability, about long-term performance. The owner, a pragmatic man named Bill, started a small shelf dedicated to Arvid's corner, stocking potted beeswax and pine tar, with photocopied instructions from Arvid's notes on blending. The true test of the system's durability, however, was still to come. The spring thaw, the village watched Arvid's property with a new, anxious fascination. Would his experiment end in the catastrophic flood everyone had initially predicted? Would his foundation turn to a soggy ruin, proving the conventional wisdom right all along? As the sun strengthened in March, the change began. The outer layers of the ice wall, exposed to direct sunlight and above freezing air, did begin to melt, but it was a slow, gentle process. The meltwater didn't cascade down, it percolated. The beeswax coating on the interior surface proved its worth beyond insulation. It acted as a superb water shedder. The water ran in controlled rivulets down channels Arvid had subtly etched into the ice, directed into gravel-filled trenches he'd prepared in the fall, which drained away from the foundation. More remarkably, the core of the wall, protected by its own insulating layer of slush and snow, remained intact for weeks longer than anyone expected. It lingered like a glacial relic, continuing its duty as a cooling mass, keeping Arvid's house pleasantly cool on unseasonably warm spring days without any need for air conditioning. The mold farm Marta had predicted never materialized. The air in the gap and around the foundation remained dry, thanks to the wise drainage and the breathable nature of the waxy barrier that had prevented moisture from being driven into the wood. One afternoon, Arvid and Liam conducted the final measurement of the season. They drilled a small core sample from the thickest part of the decaying wall. The cross-section was a revelation. The outer 6 inches were porous, crystalline, well melted. The next foot was dense, milky ice, and the inner 6 inches, adjacent to the beeswax-coated surface, was a strikingly clear, hard lens of ice, barely degraded. The coating had not only insulated, it had preserved the structural integrity of its shield until the very end. The degradation is sequential and controlled, Arvid explained to Liam and a small audience of neighbors who had gathered. Just like a good, slow-release system, it didn't fail catastrophically. It performed its duty on a schedule, right to the end, the final symbolic moment came on a day when the last vestige of the wall, a man-sized knob of ice in the shadiest corner of the yard, finally collapsed into a pile of glittering slush. There was no flood, just a damp patch on the gravel that dried by afternoon. Old man Henderson walked over from his now-thawed garden. He looked at the gone pile, then at Arvid's dry, solid foundation, and finally at Arvid's face. Well, Henderson grunted, kicking at the gravel. I suppose the roses could use a good natural mulch, if you've got any of that beeswax blend left. For the treated lumber on the new cold frames, you understand, not for the flowers. It was as close to a full surrender and a request for alliance as Henderson would ever make. Arvid just nodded, the warmth in his eyes mirroring the spring sun. I've got plenty, Lars. Let's build something that lasts. The ice fortress was gone, but its lesson was now embedded in the very soil and mindset of Silver Hollow. The village had learned that resilience wasn't about building higher walls against the cold, but about building smarter relationships with it. The following autumn in Silver Hollow felt different. There was a purposeful buzz in the air that had nothing to do with departing geese. It was the sound of saws, not just cutting firewood, but shaping frames, the hiss of sprayers, not just for dyeing lawns, but for applying natural sealants. Arvid Bjornsson's experiment had thawed more than just the ground around his house. It had melted a deeply frozen mindset. He didn't patent his blend. He didn't start a company. Instead, he gifted the recipe to the village, scribbled on index cards that were photocopied and pinned to community boards. The Bjornsson blend became a local staple, brewed in garages and backyard setups. It sent honey, pine, and a hint of citrus from the optional cedar oil. Some added a new signature perfume of the season. Not everyone built an ice wall, but many adopted the principle. The Peterson family built a thermal labyrinth of straw bales against their north wall, plastered with a clay beeswax mix. The school, using a grant the village council miraculously secured, installed a living wall of dense, evergreen shrubs. As a windbreak, its wooden support structure treated with the now famous blend. The community greenhouse extended its season using cold sink spits filled with water barrels painted black and sealed with H-wax, which absorbed daytime heat and radiated it back at night.